Hi everyone and welcome back to another video for Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis. In today's video we're just going to be continuing our series of weapon guides aimed at new players to NGS. And what we're going to look at today is the Harmonizer weapon. Now Harmonizer is a technique weapon and it's used exclusively by the Waker class. Now similar to the Gunblade video that we did for Slayer, Harmonizer is only used by Waker, so therefore this video is going to actually be more of a look at Waker in general. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the weapon, look at the basics of it, we'll look at the photon arts and just some of the skills that give you an idea of how Waker plays in NGS. Now, if you've played base game PSO2, you might be familiar with, there's a class called Summoner, and the way Summoner works is it summons pets and the pets do your attacks for you essentially. Waker is kind of NGS's interpretation of that class, but it plays quite differently. I would say it's actually simplified quite a lot from Summoner, and for me that it's the better for it. So we'll go into the weapon first of all, show you the basics of that, and then we'll go into how the summons work. So, with Waker, as I've said, your main weapon is what's called a Harmonizer, and all this is, it looks a bit like a conductor stick, conductor's baton, and your basic combination is this. There's just 3 swipes of the baton, and it does fire a little photon bullet that has a little bit of range to it. But really, really basic. You can also hold the attack button in. That will actually do a 2-hit combo that creates an explosion instead. So you can see with the uncharged one, it does make an explosion, but it's only quite a small one. Where if you hold the button, it's a much bigger explosion, so you can hit a few enemies with it. There is another benefit to the charge attack as well, which I'll go into a bit later. So next thing we need to do is look at the photon arts. So as I've said, Waker uses pets to attack with. So the photon arts are actually different ways of summoning your pet to do different attacks for you. So although you will be attacking with the Harmonizer now and again, a lot of your attacks with Waker will be using your pets to do it for you. So to break it down, Waker has access to 3 different pets. There is a werewolf-like pet called Wolfen. There is a dragon-like pet called Fredran. And there's also, I can't even describe what it looks like. It looks essentially like an inflated squirrel called Marmello. Marmello looks very similar to one of the old summons from Summoner from PSO2. Now your photon arts actually only use Fredran and Wolfen. Marmello is used quite differently. So the way the photon arts work, like a lot of classes, most of the photon arts have a normal version and a charged version. So your first photon art is what's called Fredran Breath. So it says, summons the familiar Fredran to fire a piercing breath forward. Pressing and holding the PA button will cause the attack to target multiple enemies in your field of view at the cost of additional PP. So, the way this works in practice, if you just press the button for it, it summons Fredran very briefly. It fires 3 sort of fireball shots off that hit any enemies nearby, and they do track enemies to an extent as well. If you hold the button in, you can see it will do kind of a sweep. Now, the way this works, if you've played the Ranger class, there's a photon art called, I think it's called Homing Emission or something similar to that. And it essentially allows you to fire homing bullets. And that's kind of how this photon art works. So when you hold the attack button down, if I target one of these guys here and hold the button down, what you'll notice is you can see it puts like a little additional target on them. And if there's multiple enemies in that target, it will actually hit multiples at once. But at the moment, it's just attacking one because there's only one enemy there. But if I go to this group of enemies here and hold the button down again, you can see it targets them all. So it works very similar to that rifle photon art that I mentioned earlier. So that photon art is really useful for it's really useful for attacking things like groups of enemies and so on. So that's basically how the Fredran Breath works. So next up, The next Fortnite we have is, we'll ignore the weapon action for now, we'll come back to that. The next one is Fredran Riding. So this is, summons the familiar Fredran to fire a vacuum wave at enemies. Pressing and holding the PA button will allow you to fly on Fredran at the cost of additional PP. Remain flying as long as the button is held down. Releasing the button will cause you to dismount as Fredran charges ahead to attack the enemy. This is actually quite a cool Fortnite. So the uncharged version, it's kind of hard to see, but what it does, Fredran basically attacks in front of it, and this will hit enemies directly in front of you, and it can actually launch enemies as well. But if you hold the attack button down, you actually mount Fredran and it can actually fly it, and you can actually steer this as well. And this will fly for as long as you want to go. It does lose altitude slowly, so you can't just fly it indefinitely. It will just sort of fly along the ground once it hits the ground. But you can see, as long as you hold that button down, you can just keep flying. And then when you release it, everyone will fly ahead and will kind of explode on some enemies. So again, if I release it now, you see it attacks directly in front of you, and it hits quite a big AoE. We've now also had a gigantic spawn, so this is going well. So that's the Fredran Fortnite. So next up we look at Wolfen. So Wolfen, as I said, it's a bit like a werewolf. And whereas Fredran is quite focused on ranged attacks, Wolfen is a lot more melee focused. So the first one is Wolfen Demolition. This is, summons the familiar Wolfen to fire a shockwave and then smash both fists into the ground, causing damage to nearby enemies. Pressing and holding the PA button will make the attack chargeable at the cost of additional PP. If you do not charge the attack, a shockwave attack will be released that lingers for a set time. If you charge the attack, Wolfen will launch a powerful attack forward. So there's quite a lot to this one. So if you do it uncharged, you see Wolfen appears and he slams the ground. Very, very simple. It basically hits everything around you, more or less. Now, the other way this works is if you charge it, the charge on this Fortnite is very, very long. It leaves you open for a long time while you're charging it. You can still move while you're charging it, but it takes a long time to actually get the charge. But if you fully charge this, it basically does a large explosion that hits everything around you for more damage, but you can see how long that takes to charge. So if I start charging now it's ready. So there is quite a long build up to it. If you release the button before you get to that stage, you can see he does a punch and then leaves this kind of shockwave field around you, and enemies that go into this will get hurt for a little bit as well. So there's quite a few different ways you can actually use this Fortnite. So you can use it as just a quick AoE around you, or you can do a consistent AoE that hits for a few seconds, or you can charge it fully and do a big hit. So there's quite a few different ways you can use that one. The next Fortnite is Wolfen Raid. So Wolfen Raid summons the familiar Wolfen to charge forward and perform an uppercut. Pressing and holding the PA button will unleash a combo attack forward at the cost of additional PP. This one is essentially Rushdown Fortnite, so one of the best things about this is it dashes forward quite a bit. So if you just press the button, you just get that little uppercut from Wolfen. That's all there is to it. If you hold the Fortnite button down, it does go into like a full combo. There is quite a lot to it. Now again, that one of the sort of overriding things with Waker is that if you do the charge variant of the Fortnite, they will tend to use an additional amount of PP. So it kind of depends if you've got the ability to be able to use that. Generally, I would say that in most instances, you probably want to charge for some of the Fortnite at least. So for Wolfen Raid, I would almost always charge it, because I feel that the uncharged version, just that, is really underwhelming. Whereas the charged version is actually really decent DPS on a single target. There are some Fortnites where you don't really need to charge them as much. So, for example, that first Fredran PA, This one, that's actually not bad uncharged. So that's the basic photon arts for Worker. And again, it is just those 4 that you've got. So next up, we need to talk about the weapon action. So the weapon action for Worker, this is where that third pet Marmelo comes in. So Marmelo, essentially the weapon action is a parry. So when you press it, Marmelo will spin in front of you. And that has parry frames. So it will just negate an attack. There is another feature with Marmelo, which is if you hold the button down, you'll actually start charging, and if you've got vibration on, you'll be able to tell it because it'll start vibrating. While you're charging, basically, you can still move around quite slowly, and Marmelo will stay out. Note that when you're charging like this doesn't count as your parry frames, so you basically forsake the parry to do this. But at any point, once you've held the button down, you can then release the button, and you'll throw Marmelo like a missile. And basically, Marmelo will hit whatever you've got targeted and explode and do pretty decent damage. So that's how the weapon action works. So primarily it's used as a parry. But you can also use it, for example, if the enemy gets downed, you can then hold the button and then throw Marmelo for a bit more damage. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you can see just above my weapons, there's these 3 little gauges here. And these are all connected to your different pets that you've got. So this first icon is for Fredran, the second one is for Wolfen, and the third one is for Marmelo. So what these are, for Fredran and Wolfen, there's a gauge that will build up underneath the icon the more you use their photon arts. Wolfen hasn't built up because I haven't actually hit any enemies with it, but Fredran's, you can see, is built up a little bit because I've hit enemies. So if I, for example, just go over here and just find a few enemies, and if I attack them with Wolfen, you can see we've already got a little bit of the gauge because obviously these are only quite low level enemies anyway. But you can see that little gauge underneath Wolfen has started to fill up. Now, next to Wolfen and Fredran, you can see there's also a number, which at the minute says 0. Every time you build that gauge up, you will get an extra number on that gauge. What those gauges allow you to do is they allow you to activate one of your skills that you have, which I'll come to a bit later on. And you'll basically expend those charges to use this skill. Now, next to Marmelo, you can see it's actually a little bit different. There's no gauge underneath Marmelo. Instead, there's just 2 little squares next to it. The way this works is every time you parry with Marmelo, you will, I believe, I can't know if it's after every parry or after every 2 parries, but after every so many parries, you will build up one of those gauges. And those gauges, what they do is they essentially power up Marmelo's explosion when you throw it. So the more gauge you've got built up, the more powerful Marmelo becomes and the more damage it will do when you eventually throw it. So that's kind of how the weapon action works. But next up, we need to just go into the skills that Worker uses. So if we go into the skill information. So first up, we've got Harmonizer Focus. This is hitting an enemy with a photon art will fill the focus gauge of the corresponding familiar. So that's what I've already mentioned. So the focus gauge is those gauges at the bottom of the screen, which are for each of your pets. Next up, we've got Retro Friends Rescue. So this is, you have a chance of recovering HP when your HP drops a certain percentage below max. So at level 10, which is what mine is at the minute, if I drop to 25% HP, then there is a chance that I will recover HP once I get that low. So it's just a bit of a survivability fortnight, really. Survivability skill. Then we've got Welfare Management. This is reduces damage taken and increases rest assign heal amount when your HP drops below a certain percentage. So a lot of these skills are about the survivability of your character. Because obviously your character's not really doing a great deal with Worker, it's mainly your pets that are doing things for you. So a lot of these skills are about keeping your character alive. Next we have Restore Effect Continuance. This is an interesting skill. So what this does is when you use a rest assign, which is the green healing items that you use that are scattered around the maps, the amount of HP you get from one of those will actually be reduced. But instead, you'll get a percentage of what you would have got normally. But then you'll also get HP recovery for a set time. So you can see at the moment, mine is I'll heal by 90% of what a rest assign would normally heal me by. So I'll lose 10% of that heal. But then over the next 10 seconds, I will heal by another 1.5% HP every second. So I will actually get more healing out of it overall. But that last 10 seconds, it is like a sustained HP increase. So it's almost like you get a heal and then a little bit of regen. But the initial heal is a little bit weaker. Overall, as I've said, you do actually get more health out of it. But I'm not a huge fan of it, to be honest, because I like to just know that when I've healed, my character is healed. I don't really like that it heals and then regens you for a little bit. I'd like to just have the heal straight away, but that's going to come down to your playstyle and what you prefer using. Next up, we have Lucky Sign. So this is when using a rest assign or a reverse assign, there is a chance that they won't be consumed. So you get a free heal, basically, or a free revive. Simple enough. Next one. So this is the skill I was hinting at earlier. So this is called Familiar Harmony. It's an active skill that goes on your sub-palette. And what this does is it launches a linked attack with your familiars Fredran and Wolfen by expending some of their Harmonizer focus gauges. So the way this works is as you build up your Harmonizer gauges, your focus gauges at the bottom here, so for Fredran and Wolfen, once these have got at least one charge, this icon here, which is for Familiar Harmony, will light up, and then you're able to use it. And it basically does one big attack that it does really decent damage, and it will expend the gauges that you've built up. The easiest way to show that is maybe in a combat zone. Whether I can get one at the minute, I don't know, because it's quite early in the game at the moment, and there might not be people running the level that I need. But basically, once you've built this gauge up, I may just be able to show you by just running through a combat zone, to be honest. So I'll go to Resol Forest, for example. I'll try and find some enemies. And again, basically, what you want to be looking at is these gauges at the bottom of the screen next to Fredran and Wolfen. And you want to wait for them to both fill up. There is actually someone else here, which might make it a bit easier, actually. So again, we keep attacking with Fredran and Wolfen. You can see the gauges are starting to build. Now, you might see there's these blue little sigils on some of the enemies. The way these work, I'll cover these now. If you do a charge normal attack on an enemy carrying that sigil, you'll break the sigil. And what will happen is you will then get like auto bullets that attack the enemies. So you can see that's automatically shooting the enemies now. Thought I'd cover that now because it's not very often you actually get it. So we'll just keep going. So we've almost got the gauges filled. So we'll do a bit more with Fredran. So Fredran's gauge is now at 1, so that's full. So we now do a bit with Wolfen. And that was the Marmalade parry that I did there. So again, just focusing on Fredran. Sorry, on Wolfen at the moment. And we're just trying to build that gauge up. You can also see, if you look at the bottom of the screen now, that the gauge next to Marmalade's got 1 charge on it. So it is 1 parry for 1 gauge. So we've now got that gauge filled up. So you can see that both Fredran and Wolfen at the bottom of the screen both have 1 next to their gauge now, so they're fully charged. And you can also see that the familiar harmony is now lit up in the subpalette. So now, if I just find another squad of enemies. So I don't think the gauges deplete over time as well. I think they stay as they are. So we've got a group of enemies here. We've got familiar harmony charge. So if I target this enemy and do familiar harmony, you can see those enemies all got attacked. And it did pretty decent damage. It also leaves one of those sigils on the enemies as well. That's how familiar harmony works. So it's basically a skill that you're going to build it up as you run through a map. And every time you get that gauge full, you're probably going to then use familiar harmony to do damage. But you can see now that the gauges for those pets have now dropped back down to 0 again. So now I can't use familiar harmony because it's not charged again. So I would now have to use Fredran and Wolfen photon arts to build that gauge back up again. So that's how familiar harmony works. So next up, we have Harmonizer Focus Extra. This is increases Harmonizer Focus stock to 3 for Fredran and Wolfen. So it just means that gauge can go to 3 instead of just a 1. Then we have Treble Clef Marking. This is hitting an enemy several times will cause it to be marked. Marked enemies take more damage and their down factor is increased. So the mark was that sigil that I mentioned earlier that shows up on the enemies. Then we have Marmalade Strike. This is negating a certain number of attacks of the weapon action will cause Marmalade to grow up to 2 times. Press and hold the weapon action button to throw Marmalade, causing an explosion upon a successful hit. So I've kind of already covered that. But by parrying successfully, you will make Marmalade grow, which makes it do more damage. Next up, we have Call Again PP Preservation. This is when a familiar's focus gauge stock is depleted, the PP consumption of the photon art that summons the familiar is reduced for a set time. So it basically means that it allows you to then use your photon arts more often with that pet to get its gauge back up again. Next we have Familiar Harmony Marking Clef. Just marks enemies hit by Familiar Harmony with a treble clef mark. So you can see that when I used Familiar Harmony, it marked the enemies that survived. Then we have Treble Clef Ignition. This is by pressing and holding normal attack and hitting a marked enemy, the mark will detonate. So that's again what I've already shown in that combat area. By holding in normal attack, once an enemy is treble clef marked, it will detonate the mark, it'll do damage, and it will also create a little familiar as well. Then we have Hot Marmalade Parry. So Hot Marmalade Parry, what this does, it's another active skill that goes on your subpalette, and it just says enemy attacks are negated without interrupting your own attack. So this, again, it's a parry that works exactly the same way as the normal one. So your normal parry again is this. But what you can see is if I do a photon art and try parrying, it will cancel the photon art. With Hot Marmalade Parry, if I do this, you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see it basically allows me to parry while I'm in the middle of a photon art, and the photon art will then finish as well. Whereas your regular parry, you either can't use it or it will interrupt the photon art. So it's another way of parrying, but while you're in the middle of a photon art, essentially. But to all intents and purposes, it works exactly the same as a normal Marmalade parry. So next we have Marmalade Strike Tracing. This is Marmalade Strike gains the ability to home in on enemies. This is when you throw Marmalade, it will actually have some homing ability to it. Marmalade Patience is while you have the weapon action button held down, reduces damage received and protects you from being knocked back or launched. In addition, Marmalade's gauge builds when you're hit by an attack. This allows you to build up Marmalade by just holding the button down. So again, if you hold the weapon action, move around, during this state I'll take decreased damage, and any attacks that will hit me, I won't parry them, but it will charge Marmalade's gauge. So next up, we have Familiar Harmony Marmalade Plus. This is, while Familiar Harmony is active, which is the active skill I mentioned earlier, if Marmalade's gauge is at stage 1 or higher, Marmalade performs an additional attack and consumes 1 charge. So it just adds a bit more to your Familiar Harmony attack if Marmalade's charged up as well. Then we have Familiar Support. So this is, when you activate Treble Clef Ignition, you'll generate a crest that emits periodic attacks. So Treble Clef Ignition just allows you to detonate the Treble Clef marks. Familiar Support is like an add-on to that. So when you've got Familiar Support, when you detonate a treble clef with Treble Clef Ignition, you will then make a crest that appears next to your character. Again, I showed you this while I was in the combat zone. It will basically make a little crest appear to one side of your character that will look like either Fredran or Wolfen. That crest will then do auto attacks on enemies. They don't interrupt your normal attacks, so you can still do all your normal attacks as usual. It's just additional damage that you can do. And the type of attack will vary on which familiar you summoned last. So the only thing I'm not sure on is I don't really know what the difference is in the attacks between the Wolfen mark and the Fredran mark. I would assume that maybe the Wolfen one does melee damage and the Fredran one does range, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Next we have Hot Marmalade Parry Short Cooldown. This is the cooldown time for Hot Marmalade Parry, apparently. Let's change the name, so yeah, it's Hot Marmalade Parry. So the cooldown time for Hot Marmalade Parry is reduced when the shield does not receive any attack from enemies. So essentially, if you go to parry with Hot Marmalade Parry and you don't get hit, so you waste the parry, it will cool down faster. Then we have Harmonizer Parry Counter. This is performing a normal attack upon successfully negating an attack with a weapon action unleashes a counter attack. So it's just a parry by using your normal attack though, rather than using your actual parry on your weapon action. So you effectively got effectively 3 different parries with Waker. You've got the weapon parry with this skill. You've got the Marmalade Parry and the Hot Marmalade Parry as well. Then we have Linear Drive. This is quite an interesting skill list. So it says move forward at high speed and attack by pressing the normal attack button at just the right time after a photon art. Pressing back on the directional pad will cause you to retreat. So this is very, very similar to, there is a skill that Fighter uses with Twin Daggers, which I think is called Acceleration Drive, which allows you to close in on an enemy really, really quickly. And this is basically the same thing, but for Waker. So if you do a photon art, if you watch when I do this, if you look at my character, at the end of it, she glows purple. And basically, when she glows purple at the end, if I press a normal attack during that, you'll dash forward. You can probably see it a lot easier if I target something with it, because I think it works like Acceleration Drive, and if you target something, it will actually close in quicker. So if I go over these terms here and target one of them, the problem is it's probably going to kill with the photon art. If I do like this close range photon art, and then dash, you can see I dash forward really, really quickly. So it's a quick way of closing in on enemies. So it essentially works the same way as Fighter's Acceleration Drive. It's just a way of getting you into a group of enemies a lot faster. So next up we have Familiar Support Amplifier. This is each time you activate Familiar Support again while it's already active, that Familiar's focus gauge increases for a set time. So it's just another way of boosting your Familiar focus gauges. And as a reminder, Familiar Support was when you got the crests that auto attack enemies. So every time you get that your Familiar gauges will then increase faster. Next up we have Harmonizer Parry PP again. This is recover PP whenever you successfully negate an attack with a weapon action. Now the interesting thing about this is it says Harmonizer PP Parry gain, but then it mentions weapon action. So your weapon action is your Marmalade Parry. So this basically means that when you parry, you'll just gain some PP back. As for whether it's from your weapon parry or your weapon action parry, I'm not sure. That could be a miswording. So you might want to check that out. But it basically it's a way of just getting some PP back so that you can use your photon arts more often. And then lastly, we have Linear Drive Encore. So linear drive again is that skill I've just shown which advances you towards an enemy. With linear drive on core, you can actually make an additional move forward or back and launch an attack by pressing a normal attack at the right time just after a linear drive. So this again, if I target an enemy, do a photon art, do a linear drive, and then do a normal attack again. So you can see I can actually dash forward twice and do an extra attack at the end of it. So Waker can actually get in even faster than Fighter because you can actually dash in twice. So it's actually really, really useful for sort of adjusting your position. And it makes Waker a very, very mobile class. That's a breakdown of how the different photon arts work. As I said, for Waker, you do just use a Harmonizer. So I wanted this video to be more of just a general look at Waker in general. That's more or less how it works. If you've got any questions at all about Waker or anything like that, just leave them in the comments below and I'll try and answer what I can. Hopefully this has been relatively useful. I'm still fairly new to using Waker. As you can tell, I'm not even capped on this character yet. But so I am still learning it myself, but I wanted to do a video just to kind of show how it works. In next videos, we'll cover some other weapons and continue this series on the weapon guides. And as I've mentioned in a previous video, we are moving to 2 uploads a week now. So we're going to be doing 1 upload on a weekend and then 1 during midweek as well. But for the meantime, I'll end this video there. Any questions, just leave them in the comments below. I'll try and answer what I can. And I'll see you guys in the next video.